There is a guy in a suburb outside of Houston right now. It is Saturday morning, barely past 7. His neighbors are still asleep. His wife is still asleep. But he has been awake for an hour already, standing in his garage under fluorescent lights, staring at a Mustang GT that by every practical measure runs perfectly fine. He has a list on his phone. Coil over suspension. Cold air intake, a tune. Aftermarket wheels he has been looking at for 6 months. His buddy told him last week he was crazy. His brother-in-law asked him why he does not just buy a newer one. He heard both of them. He is not buying a newer one. This is not a story about a car. It never was. When a man decides to modify a vehicle he already owns, something is happening beneath the surface that has nothing to do with horsepower numbers or quarter-mile times. It has to do with identity, with control, with a need so fundamental to the human experience that psychologists have spent decades trying to name it properly. And if you have ever stood in an AutoZone longer than you should have, or watched one more YouTube video about suspension geometry at midnight when you should have been asleep, then some part of what follows is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. Let's start where it actually starts, not in the garage, in the mind. Consumer psychologists have a concept called the extended self. The idea, developed by researcher Russell Belk in the 1980s, is that human beings do not experience a clean boundary between themselves and the objects they own. We absorb our possessions into our sense of identity. We use them to signal who we are, who we were, and who we are trying to become. Most possessions sit on a shelf or hang in a closet. A car is different. A car is something you inhabit. You spend more time inside your vehicle than you do in most rooms of your house. It moves through the world with you. It is seen by strangers, by coworkers, by the people at the light next to you on the highway. It broadcasts something about you before you ever open your mouth. When a man modifies that car, he is not adjusting a machine. He is editing a public statement about who he is. Every modification is a sentence. The sum of them is a paragraph. And that paragraph is addressed to everyone watching, including himself. Think about the average American man over 35. He works a job where most of his output is invisible. Emails sent. Meetings attended. Decisions made that will take months to show any result. He comes home to responsibilities that are real and important, but that do not produce anything he can point to and say, without question, that he built that. The garage is different. When you lower the suspension on a Camaro, the result is immediate and physical. You can see it. You can feel it on the first turn out of the driveway, when you install a cold air intake and feel the throttle response sharpen under your right foot. That change is not a matter of interpretation or opinion. It happened. You made it happen. In a life full of ambiguous outcomes and delayed feedback, the garage offers something increasingly rare in modern American life, a place where effort produces a visible, verifiable, undeniable result. Psychologists call this self-efficacy, the felt sense that your actions produce real outcomes in the world. It is one of the strongest predictors of psychological well-being ever identified. And for a generation of American men who grew up watching their fathers work on Camaros and F-150s in the driveway on Sunday afternoons, the garage is one of the last places where self-efficacy feels completely and immediately within reach. There is a man named Kevin from outside of San Antonio. He started modifying cars at 22, working on a beat-up RX he bought with money saved from 2 jobs. When asked why he spent money he barely had on parts he technically did not need, he said something that stopped the conversation cold. He said that growing up, his family moved 4 times before he finished high school. Different cities, different schools, different bedrooms that never quite felt like his. He never had a space that felt permanently his own. But the car went with him every time. And every modification he made to it was a decision that no one could take back. A mark that stayed. A piece of something stable in a life that kept rearranging itself without asking his permission. That is not a story about a Subaru. That is a story about a man who needed one thing in his life that he could control completely. And he found it under the hood. This need for control is not unique to Kevin. It runs through car modification culture like a current beneath the surface. And it intensifies, reliably and predictably, during periods of stress and transition. Research on compensatory behavior shows that when people feel a loss of control in one area of their lives, a difficult job situation, a strained relationship, financial pressure, the general accumulating weight of middle age, they seek to restore that sense of agency somewhere else. Somewhere bounded. Somewhere where the rules are clear, the results are honest, and the only variable is how much effort and attention you bring to the problem. The garage becomes that place. The project car becomes that project, not because the man is avoiding his life, but because he is doing something his nervous system genuinely needs. He is rebuilding, in miniature, the experience of competence and control that the rest of the week may have quietly and steadily eroded. This is why you will find a disproportionate number of serious car builders among men going through significant life transitions. A divorce, a career change. The years after the kids leave the house and the purpose that came with raising them suddenly needs to be replaced with something else. The car is not a distraction from those things. It is a response to them. A way of saying, in the most physical and honest language available, that there is still something here I can figure out. Something I can make better with my own hands. Now consider the community dimension, because this is where the psychology gets genuinely interesting and where the story becomes about something much larger than one man in one garage. Walk into any car meet on a Friday night in Dallas or Phoenix or outside of Charlotte and pay close attention to what is actually happening. Men who have never met each other are crouching next to wheel wells, asking questions, offering opinions, sharing information they spent years accumulating through trial and error and expensive mistakes. There is a social fluency in those parking lots that does not exist in most other contexts of adult male life in America. Abraham Maslow identified belonging as one of the core human needs, sitting just above safety in his famous hierarchy of what human beings require to thrive. For a lot of American men, especially past 35, the social structures that used to provide that belonging have thinned out considerably. The friend group from college scattered across the country. The neighborhood does not work the way it used to. The institutions that once organized male social life have hollowed out or disappeared entirely. Car culture fills that gap in a way that feels earned rather than manufactured or artificial. You do not belong simply because you showed up. You belong because you know things. Because you built something. Because you can look at a stance from across a parking lot and tell immediately whether the alignment is right or whether the owner has more work to do. That knowledge is a membership card, and it was paid for with time and effort and skin knuckles and late Saturday nights. Which means it means something real. There is also a creative dimension to car modification that almost never gets the credit it deserves, particularly from people outside the culture who see only the money spent and the noise produced. Modifying a car is at its core an act of design. The man choosing his wheel fitment, his ride height, his color scheme. His power modifications, he is making aesthetic and functional decisions that are indistinguishable in their nature from what any serious artist or designer does. He is taking something mass-produced, something that rolled off an assembly line in Kentucky or Ohio identical to 40,000 others, and making it singular. Making it specific, making it his in a way that the factory version never was and never could be. Neuroscience research is clear on what happens in the brain when a person completes a creative project they have invested genuine time and effort into. dopamine is released. The same reward circuitry that fires when a painter steps back from a finished canvas, or a writer types the last line of something they are genuinely proud of. The man who just finished a full bolt-on build and takes it out on the highway for the first time is experiencing a neurological event that is real and measurable. The satisfaction is not metaphorical. It is chemical. It is the brain rewarding the behavior it was designed to reward the completion of something difficult that required sustained effort and skill. And then, almost immediately, he starts thinking about the next modification. It would be dishonest to tell only the flattering version of this story. The psychology of car modification is not always coming from a healthy or self-aware place, and the people who live inside this culture know it better than anyone. There is a concept in psychology called compensatory consumption, the pattern of purchasing or modifying things to compensate for perceived inadequacies in other areas of life. The loud exhaust on a car that does not need to be loud. The aggressive body kit on a daily driver that spends most of its life in a suburban parking lot. The modifications that seem designed less to improve the car and more to demand a specific kind of response from the people around it. Research interviews with modified car owners have found a consistent thread among a notable subset of them, a feeling of being overlooked in their professional or personal lives. Underestimated at work, passed over for opportunities they felt they deserved. Not taken seriously in the ways that mattered to them, the car becomes a tool for commanding the attention and respect that the rest of life has not delivered on its own. The modification is not really about the car, it is about being seen. About existing loudly enough that the world cannot ignore you the way it sometimes feels like it has been trying to. This does not make those men broken or shallow. It makes them human. The need to be seen and acknowledged is not a character flaw. It is one of the oldest and most fundamental needs in the entire catalog of human psychology. But it is worth being honest about. Because the man who understands why he is building the car he is building has a fundamentally different relationship with the process than the man who does not. What unites all of it, the control, the creativity, the community, the compensation, is something simpler and more fundamental than any of those individual words. The man modifying his car is refusing to be passive about the things that matter to him. In a culture that increasingly asks people to consume rather than create, to replace rather than repair, to upgrade on a schedule determined by someone else's marketing department rather than by genuine need or desire, the guy in the garage on Saturday morning is doing something quietly and genuinely countercultural. He is saying that this thing is worth his time, that the process matters as much as the result, that the work of his own hands is worth more to him than something he could have just ordered online and had delivered to his door. That is not obsession. That is not arrested development or irresponsibility with money. That is a value system, expressed in the only language that feels completely honest to him. And value systems expressed through action, through the actual expenditure of time and effort and attention, are the only kind that mean anything. There is also the matter of mastery, and mastery turns out to be one of the most underrated forces in a man's psychological life, particularly in the middle decades when so much of what he does professionally feels like maintenance rather than growth. The psychologist Anders Ericsson spent his career studying what separates people who become genuinely skilled at something from people who remain perpetually average at it. His conclusion was not talent. It was not natural ability or innate intelligence. It was deliberate practice, the specific kind of effortful, focused repetition that pushes a person just beyond the edge of their current capability and forces genuine adaptation and growth. Car modification is a natural environment for exactly this kind of development. The first time a man installs his own coilovers, it takes an entire Saturday and 3 phone calls to someone who has done it before. The 5th time, it takes 2 hours and he does not have to look anything up. The first time he attempts a tune, he is essentially guessing and hoping. The 10th time, he can feel what the car needs before the data confirms it. That progression from confusion to competence, from hesitation to fluency, from not knowing to knowing in the specific way that only comes from doing, is one of the most satisfying arcs available to a human being at any age. And it never fully ends. There is always a more advanced technique to learn, a more complex system to understand, a higher level of skill to pursue. The ceiling keeps rising, which means the motivation to keep climbing never disappears entirely. This is why men who get serious about cars rarely stop at one build and rarely stop developing. The skills transfer. The confidence transfers. The man who learned to tune his own suspension starts looking at his engine differently. The man who built his engine starts thinking about fabrication. The hobby expands because the person expands, and the person expands because the hobby demands it. So the next time you see a modified Mustang sitting in rush hour traffic on I-10, or a slammed truck in the parking lot of a Home Depot on a Wednesday afternoon, or a Challenger with an exhaust note that rattles the windows of the car next to it at a stoplight before you form the easy opinion about the driver, consider what you are actually looking at. You are looking at someone who found a domain where effort is rewarded honestly and immediately, where skill is respected by the people who understand it, where identity can be expressed without apology or explanation. You are looking at someone who needed one corner of their life to be completely and unambiguously theirs, and who built that corner with their own hands over many Saturday mornings. The car is not the point. It never was. The question worth sitting with is this: what is the thing in your own life that you have been waiting for permission to build? What is the project that keeps coming back to you, that you keep setting aside because the timing is not right, or the money is not there, or someone in your life thinks it is not practical, because the man in that garage stopped waiting for permission a long time ago? And on Saturday mornings, when the neighborhood is still quiet and the fluorescent lights are on and the car is up on jack stands and the problem in front of him is real and solvable and entirely his to figure out, he is exactly where he is supposed to be.